Hey everyone, thank you for joining week 14 of the Sustainable Development Goals for Business series, and welcome. My name is Pierangelo Rosati. I will be your MC for today's talk on SDG 14, Life Below the Water. SDG4B is a free online seminar series that explores the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and how these are impacting business and society. As you might be aware, the 17 interlinked SDGs were developed to provide a blueprint for a better and more sustainable future for all. Today, specifically, we are looking at SDG 14, Life Below the Water, which aims to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. We are delighted to be joined by Dr. David Horan, Marie Curie postdoctoral researcher at UCD's School of Politics and International Relations, who will discuss Ireland's plan for implementing SDG 14. For our audience, please use the Q&A function to ask questions throughout the talk, and we'll try to address as many questions as possible at the end. Please note that the chat is disabled, so you can only use the Q&A function to submit your questions. So with no further delay, I'll hand you over to David. David, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. You should be able to share your screen when you're ready and to get started.
Sure. Okay, so thank you, Pierangelo, for the kind introduction. Just before we start, I want to thank Professor Theo Lind for the invitation to speak here today, and I'm very grateful for the invite and delighted that you are all here. It's especially nice to be back at the business school and to see old colleagues and friends on the line, as well as new faces. So today I'm going to talk about SDG 14 and in particular Ireland's baseline for implementing this global oceans goal. And the main purpose of the assessment will be to try to facilitate a more coordinated approach to its implementation by government departments in Ireland. So to outline my talk, we'll begin with a brief overview of the 2030 Agenda and SDG 14. Then I'll outline the need for an integrated approach to its implementation. And the main body of the talk will focus on presenting some indicator-based tools that I have developed to support a more integrated approach to the implementation of SDG 14 in Ireland. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So just to start, the 2030 Agenda, what does it do? Well, it sets the agenda at global level for sustainable development in terms of 17 goals, 169 targets, and 232 indicators. So you can see here on the right-hand side that it's quite a broad framework in that it covers many different policy areas and global challenges. Now, the agenda outlines 7 means to implement the goals, and these are policy coherence, data and monitoring, mobilization of finance, the development and deployment of more sustainable technologies, trade, capacity building, and partnerships for the goals. And today I'm going to discuss the role of data and monitoring in the implementation of SDG 14 in Ireland. So just turning to that goal, its overarching objective is to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. So the goal actually consists of 10 targets, and the main elements are firstly to reduce marine pollution from different sources. So this includes nutrient runoff from agriculture, untreated wastewater from households and industry, as well as plastic debris from municipal waste that ends up in the oceans. The second main element is to implement more effective marine spatial planning, in particular with a focus on protecting marine and coastal ecosystems. The third element concerns sustainable fishing, in particular to end overfishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. The fourth element is about marine protection, and it has the target to conserve at least 10% of coastal and marine areas. And then finally, the fifth element links with the ocean-based economy and calls for an increase in the economic benefits from the sustainable use of ocean resources. So when we think about implementing this goal at national level, two key challenges are, first of all, the need for an integrated approach. So there's a lot of literature that documents the interlinkages between SDG 14 and the other goals and targets. So just to take the example of marine pollution, progress on reducing marine pollution, these studies have shown is strongly dependent on, for instance, SDG 2, more sustainable practices in agriculture, SDG 6, wastewater treatment, and SDG 12, sustainable consumption and production, okay, amongst other interactions. So one challenge for implementation is how to account for all these different interlinkages. The second challenge at national level concerns how governments are organized. So there's a number of studies pointing to which highlights that governments are not effectively organized to deal with the many interlinkages between the goals and targets. So typically what governments have been doing is they've been taking the SDGs, the 17 goals and 169 targets, and dividing them up amongst the different government departments who tend to specialize and prioritize different areas for implementation. So up to now, the tradition has been that government departments have operated in quite a siloed manner with limited communication and coordination across the different departments. So in the paper titled Enabling an Integrated Policy Making with the SDGs, which was published in Sustainability last October, I addressed this problem of policy coordination across government departments in Ireland for implementing SDG 14. And a policy brief titled Assessing Baselines and Coordinating Actions for the SDGs was published in the IISD SDG Knowledge Hub, which is one of the main online magazines read by the SDG community. Okay, so what's nice about applying it to Ireland, the case of Ireland, is that in our national implementation plan for the SDGs for 2018 to 2020, it provides a clear account of how the responsibilities for implementing the different goals was divided up amongst the government departments in Ireland in that period. So the 169 targets were divided between 16 government departments, and the implementation plan provides a list, an account for each target who is the government department with primary responsibility for implementing that target. So that implementation plan allows us to illustrate the problem in a more concrete way that the paper addresses. So according to the National Implementation Plan, the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government had primary responsibility for implementing SDG 14. Now, according to the International Council for Science report in 2017 on SDG 14 interlinkages, it identified 97 target level interactions between SDG 14 and the other goals. And in particular, it noted the strongest interactions on livelihoods, SDG 1, food security and nutrition, SDG 2, decent jobs and economic growth, SDG 8, sustainable consumption and production, SDG 12, and climate action, SDG 13, amongst other interactions. So despite the clear connections, responsibilities for these other goals rest primarily with these departments that are listed here. So the question that the paper addresses is how can the Departments of Housing, Planning and Local Governments take account of all of these different interlinkages when it tries to meet its responsibilities for implementation on SDG 14. So when we turn to the literature for guidance on this, most of the efforts to date focus on enhancing cooperation among the different ministries. And there's two main approaches are proposed. First is what's called a whole of government approach. So here policies are agreed by all departments, and this approach has been particularly popular in policy circles. Most countries, including Ireland, have established interdepartmental working groups to facilitate a whole of government approach. Now, Newegg did a study in 2019 to assess the effects of these working groups on SDG achievement. It was a cross-country econometric analysis, and he found no significant evidence of their effectiveness. So what seems to be going on here is that the departments are operating outside of the main policy-making processes. Now, the other approach is called a nexus approach, and this is quite popular in long-term planning and modeling. And it typically proposes collaborations among usually 2 to 3 government departments. So the approach in this literature is to discuss highly interconnected issues, often it's water, energy, and food, in a combined manner. So when we look at the problem that we're trying to address, neither of these approaches seem particularly satisfactory. On the one hand, the whole of government approach appears to be advocating too much collaboration, in that it's calling for all government departments, all 16 government departments in Ireland, to get together to considering potentially all linkages, to get together and agree policy. Okay, it's at least in a first order sense, it's not clear that everything is related to everything. On the other hand, the nexus approach appears to be calling for too little collaboration, and that clearly there are interlinkages beyond the nexus that need to be accounted for. So the first gap in the literature is that there is a lack of technical tools to systematically bring together the relevant government departments. So my paper addresses this gap by proposing a data-driven, indicator-based approach to identify the relevant departments to bring together. So that approach, as we will see, tries to find a middle ground between the high level of cooperation advocated by the whole of government approach and the low level of cooperation advocated by the nexus approach. Now, a second related gap that the paper also addresses is the role that narrow monitoring and evaluation systems can play in restricting integration. So in some sense, this is actually a more fundamental problem. So typically ministries, when they assess how they are performing, they will do so based on a small number of sector-specific, they'll do it in a very siloed manner based on a small number of sector-specific considerations. So if you just take SDG 14 as an example, they might be whether a marine spatial plan has been developed, or whether Ireland has become a member of an international agreement to restrict harmful fishing subsidies, or if they're looking at indicators. Usually it will focus on the specific sector, like what's the extent of protected areas that are covered, or how polluted our coastal waters are. So what I propose in the paper is to broaden these systems to include indicators in related policy areas. So for example, if you're the Department for Marine and you're concerned with reducing marine pollution, and we know from the analysis of interlinkages that this is connected with, for example, nutrient runoff from agriculture, wastewater treatment, the level of wastewater treatments in the country, and that progress on that goal has impacts also on things like nutrition and also on things like health and well-being. So the idea is to take indicators of nutrient runoff, wastewater treatment, levels of obesity, levels of well-being in the country, and to bring them into the monitoring and evaluation systems of the Marine Department so that they at least care to some extent about outcomes on those variables. And the purpose of this is to use indicators as a communication and coordination device between government departments. So, for example, a low achievement on sustainable agriculture or on a low level of wastewater treatment could act as a signal to the Department of Marine for the need to integrate policies across areas. So to operationalize this approach, what I propose is a dashboard approach rather than a headline index. And this is because of the many different interlinkages that can exist between policy areas. So we're used to the notion of headline indices, more in the context of communication between scientists who produce the information and decision makers like voters and politicians who decide broad policy priorities. But when we move down to communication between government departments, policymakers typically tend to need more structured information more detailed information to design effective policies. And for that reason, I propose to use a dashboard rather than a headline index. So what does the paper do? Well, first of all, it presents an SDG-based monitoring tool that government departments can use to work with other departments on integrated policy making. Secondly, it demonstrates by way of an example to SDG14, the role that a dashboard of interrelated indicators could play in coordinating government ministries for integrated policy making. And thirdly, then, it presents a systematic method for indicator selection in order to construct the dashboards and uses that dashboard then to assess Ireland's performance on SDG 14 in an integrated way. So the dashboard will include indicators of how Ireland is performing on SDG 14, but it will also include indicators that can be used to assess how Ireland is performing in policy areas that are directly connected to SDG 14 achievement. And secondly, then, the paper uses gap analysis to assess the depth of challenges on each of the selected indicators in order to develop specific proposals for which departments should cooperate and what policy areas the discussions should focus on. So just to put this up front, the main recommendations are, first of all, that Ireland's lead department for SDG 14 achievements should cooperate with 9 other government departments on 15 policy issues. So if you compare this to the other approaches, at that time in Ireland, there was 16 government departments. So the proposal is considerably, the level of cooperation proposed is considerably less than that which you will get under a whole of government approach. Whereas on the other hand, it's considerably more than what Nexus approaches are suggesting. And the tool brings the discussion a little bit further by actually identifying specific policy areas for integrated policy making. Okay, the second main recommendation is then to embed the dashboards in ministries' monitoring and evaluation systems, particularly in the policy preparation stage. Okay, and the reason for that is to try and operationalize the approach by incentivizing integrated policy making. So now we'll just turn to the method for indicator selection. It's a 5-step procedure, and I'm going to go into some detail now on each of the different steps in the process. So the first step is to define your focal points. These are the departments and targets of interest. So if you see here on the left-hand side, I selected for the study 4 targets for the SDG 14 goal. 2 of them are conservation related. These are marine pollution and reducing marine pollution and enhancing marine protection. and two of them then are fisheries related. One is to increase sustainable fisheries, and the second one is to raise economic benefits from fishing. Now, on the right-hand side here, according to the National Implementation Plan, the responsibility for implementing these targets is divided amongst three government departments. These are the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And for the study, I selected the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government as the lead department, as a department with lead responsibility for implementing this goal. And the reason why I chose them is because they have primary responsibility for developing a marine spatial plan. So they seemed like the appropriate choice for this study. Okay, so once you have your focal points, the next step then is to choose a method for assessing progress. So in order to assess Ireland's performance on SDG 14, a cross-country baseline assessment was conducted. So a baseline assessment looks at the current progress on each of the targets. And for that type of assessment, you just need cross-sectional data. And I'll discuss a bit later the peer group that was used for the cross-country elements in the study. But basically, a cross-country baseline assessment is quite useful in the sense that we're just looking at one point in time, so we don't need to consider changes in the interlinkages over time. And by doing a cross-country analysis, we can use international assessments of the interlinkages to guide the analysis. Okay, so in the next step then is the identification of linkages between the targets of interest and the other SDGs. So for this step, I used the International Council of Sciences 2017 analysis of SDG 14 linkages to identify potential interactions. And this analysis focused on all first order interactions at goal level. So typically in these studies, the results of the analysis are summarized either in a network or a matrix or a table. And for my study, I summarized the findings in a table. So at the top here, we have the potential influence of progress on SDG 14 and the other goals. And at the bottom here, we have the potential influence of progress on the other SDGs on the marine targets. So what you can see is that there are many interactions. Some of them are positive, which we call synergies. Some of them are negative, which we call trade-offs. Typically, as you can see from the table, the synergies tend to dominate the trade-offs in a ratio of 2:1. So that's a typical finding of these studies. And at least in a first order sense, not everything is connected to everything else, although there are pervasive interactions for some goals. So for example, progress on SDG 14 tends to have pervasive potential interactions with livelihoods, food security and nutrition, decent work and economic growth, reducing inequalities, and sustainable urbanization. On the other hand, progress on goals such as livelihoods, education, clean energy, economic growth, industry and innovation, sustainable urbanization, climate action, these all have pervasive interactions with SDG 14 achievements. And then the last two goals, which is SDG 16, effective public sectors, and SDG 17, partnerships for the goals, they tend to be seen as key enablers for the achievement of all the other goals. Okay, so once you have the analysis of interlinkages done, the next step then is to select the indicators. So in this step, I used 4 criteria. First of all was to cover only the official indicators. And this was done for transparency purposes. So you can imagine if this was applied in practice, it would be good that government departments are not cherry picking the indicators that they include. The second criterion is relevancy to the targets of interest. So here, this requires that when we're looking at performance on SDG 14, they're being assessed with the official indicators, okay, with the indicators that have been officially linked to those targets. The third criterion then is relevancy to the linkages. So this criterion requires that you select the best available indicators that are relevant to the targets identified in the analysis of linkages. And the fourth criterion is that overall to try to keep the indicator set parsimonious in order to ensure an effective monitoring tool. Now, there has been a lot of progress on filling data gaps for the official indicators, but there are still remaining data gaps. So in order to broaden the scope of the assessment, I also used proxy indicators, and these were taken from the Sustainable Development Report in 2019. So just to give you an idea of how the relevancy criterion worked for the SDG 14 targets, you can see here in the center that for each of those targets are listed the official UN indicators. And to the right of that then is the UN tier assessment for each of those indicators. So that signifies how ready to use they are in practice. So tier 1 means data is widely available. Tier 2 means that their data is not widely available. So for the study, I was able to use the official indicators for 2 of the targets. These are sustainable fisheries, which is assessed by fish stock status, which is the proportion of fishing stocks, the proportion of fish stocks that are within biologically sustainable limits. I was able to use the official indicator for marine protection, which is the proportion of protected area a proportion of area in the economic exclusive zone that is actually protected. Now, in the case of marine pollution, there's not enough data available for the official indicators, but there is a good proxy that we can use, which is the Clean Waters Measure in the Ocean Health Index, and this proxy was taken from the Sustainable Development Report. Now, for raising economic benefits, the official indicator is sustainable fisheries as a proportion of GDP. That was recently classified as tier 1. However, FAO hasn't released the data. So I had to use a proxy for that, and it was fisheries revenue per square kilometer of the exclusive economic zone. So that is actually, can be thought of as a measure of ocean productivity, in that it's revenue per square kilometer. Okay, so that was for the relevancy criterion for the SDG 14 targets. Just to give you an idea of how the relevancy criterion worked for the linkages. So from the analysis of linkages, we know that better quality institutions, inclusive decision-making, and mobilization of finance, greater mobilization of finance are all important for SDG 14 achievement. Now, for these goals, I had to rely on using 16 and 17. There are often data gaps, so I had to rely quite a lot on proxy indicators here. So for the first one, for quality of institutions, freedom of the press was used as a proxy. For more inclusive decision-making, seats held by women in national parliaments was used as a proxy for that linkage. And finally then, for mobilization of finance, the official indicator is ODA. That is, data is widely available, but for the purpose of our studies, it's not relevant. So the best available indicator was government spending on health and education, which I used as a proxy for spending on sustainable development. Okay, so once you have your indicators, the next step then is to assign SDG responsibilities. So for each selected indicator, this step identifies the lead department in Ireland with responsibility for implementing the target related to that indicator. So in this step, the identification was based on and the assignment of responsibilities reported in the National Implementation Plan for 2018 to 2020. So following these 5 steps resulted in a dashboard of 33 indicators, 4 of them related to SDG14 achievements, and then there were 29 linkage indicators. So in the center column here are listed the different indicators that we used in the study. And in the column to the right of that is a list of the departments that have primary responsibility for each of the associated indicators. Okay, so this is just the first half of the dashboard. These are the rest of the indicators that make up this dashboard. Now, what you can see is there's quite a lot of linkage indicators. So to simplify to provide a simple framework for the integrated assessment, what I did was, in order to express potential causal interrelations with SDG14 achievements, I divided the 29 linkage indicators into 3 components. These are pressures, impacts, and responses. So the 10 pressures refer to indicators that potentially influence the achievement of SDG 14. So for example, these included the poverty rate, because poverty can put pressure on marine environments and cause marine pollution. Similarly with nitrogen use in agriculture, wastewater, untreated wastewater as well. Impacts, these refer to indicators that are potentially influenced by progress on SDG 14. So for example here, more sustainable fishing or better protection of marine environments can help to reduce poverty in coastal areas. More sustainable fishing through better nutrition can reduce the level of obesity in a country, and cleaner marine environments can improve health and well-being. Okay, so these are just some examples of this. The third category then are responses, and these are country capacities to manage SDG 14 achievements. And some examples of the 8 capacity indicators that were identified are educational attainment, science and technology, and perceived corruption. Okay, so all of those can have a potential influence on SDG 14 achievement. So why are we doing this? Well, packaging indicators in this manner helps to provide an accessible and holistic assessment of Ireland's baseline as it attempts to implement SDG 14 in an integrated way. So to conduct the baseline analysis, to measure Ireland's current performance on each indicator, I use the min-max formula. So X here is the current or observed value, A is the minimum or worst value, and B is the target's value. And Y is the normalized or transformed value. So all data was collected from the Sustainable Development Report in 2019 for the year 2018. Okay, so once you have your normalized values, to identify strengths and challenges on each of the indicators, a traffic light color coding scheme was used. So green signifies whether the target is achieved, yellow that challenges remain, orange that there are significant challenges, and red that there are major challenges. And as you can see here, I'm taking differences in this score of differences of 20 points to be considerable for the assessment. Okay, so bringing it all together, we can use radar diagrams to provide an integrated baseline assessment of Ireland's position for implementing SDG 14. So in the radar diagrams, the higher the distance from the center, the higher is Ireland's performance on that particular target. So the assessment involved 2 steps. Firstly, we look at SDG 14, ignoring the linkages, and then in the second step, we do the integrated assessment that explicitly accounts for these linkages. So firstly, if we just look at marine performance, what we can see is that Ireland faces major challenges on marine protection. It faces significant challenges on marine pollution, and challenges remain on sustainable fisheries and raising economic benefits from fisheries. Now, when we move to the integrated assessment, what we can see is that the greatest number of challenges appear on the pressures. So in particular, Ireland faces challenges on sustainable agriculture, wastewater treatment, renewable energy expansion, quality infrastructure, municipal waste, greenhouse gas emissions, and imported biodiversity threats. There are also challenges on country capacities to manage SDG 14 achievements. In particular, we can see gaps on science and technology, perceived corruption, inclusive decision-making, and public spending on sustainable development. And finally, then, when we look at the impacts, improved performance on SDG 14 could potentially contribute to, while we do quite well, on the impacts, there are several areas where improved performance on SDG 14 could help for progress on these goals. So in areas, we have remaining challenges on things like nutrition, gender equality, and employment. Okay, so once a profile has been ascertained, we can bring information on the challenges and match that with the mapping of responsibilities for the government departments to get some insight on who the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government should be cooperating with, and on what policy areas the discussions should focus on. So the table here, the rows list the departments to engage, and the entries are the policy areas for discussion. And you can see that these have been categorized according to the nature of the interlinkages. And I have used the color coding scheme to rank the depth of challenges in each of these policy areas. So the main recommendations then are that the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government should cooperate with 9 other departments to address challenges in 15 policy areas. Cooperation is proposed with the Departments of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment in 3 areas. The Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation, the Department of Justice and Equality, and the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform in 2 areas, whereas discussions with the Department of Health, Department of Culture and the Gaeltacht, Finance and Foreign Affairs and Trade are all 1 area. 6 challenges arise on the pressures, 4 on capacities and 3 on the impacts. And priority areas to address include major challenges on pressures such as greenhouse gas emissions, renewable energy expansion and municipal waste, all with the Departments of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment. Whereas on capacities, there are remaining challenges on public spending to be discussed with the Department of Finance, on innovation to be discussed with the Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation, on corruption to be discussed with the Department of Justice and Equality, and on inclusive decision making with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. Okay, so that's as far as you can go in terms of recommendations with that type of analysis. Now you can provide an extra layer to the recommendations. One way of doing that is by doing a comparative analysis or cross-country analysis to get a sense of how Ireland is performing internationally. So broadly speaking, there are 2 possible approaches here. One is to develop an integrated composite index to get a sense of how Ireland's performance ranks in an overall relative to other countries. And the alternative approach then is not to aggregate and focus on specific indicators and to use cross-country comparisons to shed light on whether Ireland is leading or lagging on specific challenges. So just quickly, I'm going to take each of these in turn. So firstly, in a composite approach, there is a small literature on SDG indices, but none of them focus on specific goals such as SDG14 and account for all first order interlinkages with the other goals. The closest paper is that of Nema Chena, who produced an integrated agricultural index based on a small number, following basically a nexus approach based on a small number of interlinkages between SDG2 and a handful of other goals. So what I did in this paper was to develop a composite integrated SDG14 index that accounted for all of the first order interlinkages. So the basic idea behind the composites was to essentially add up the 4 marine indicators and the 29 linkage indicators that we saw in the dashboards. But one problem with aggregating is that you need to be careful not to, if you apply the standard equal weighting to each of the indicators, you can end up with quite an unbalanced assessment in that because there are so few marine indicators and so many linkage indicators, equal weighting will mean that what's happening on the linkage components drives the overall assessment. So to try and get a balanced assessment, what I did was I assigned equal weights to each of the 2 dimensions, the marine indicators and the linkage indicators. And then I gave slightly higher weights to the marine indicators and a slightly lower weight to the linkage indicators. So I applied then the composites to 35 island states to get a sense of how Ireland is performing. And this is the country scoreboards. And you can see that overall Ireland was ranked 4th in terms of our baseline for integrated implementation of SDG 14. So focusing first on our performance on the marine indicators, we can see that the SDG 14 index ranked us as 5th with 56% of targets achieved. So how does that perform? How are we doing internationally? Well, compared to the UK, who is leading on this index, we can see there's a considerable difference. They have 81% of targets achieved. Now, when you turn to the linkages components, what you see is that under pressures, Ireland is considerably underperforming internationally. We were ranked 14th with only 56% of the targets achieved. We do considerably better on the impact components and also on the capacity components, although some challenges remain. Here we have 76% of the targets achieved. Okay, so that type of assessment gives us a sense of where we stand internationally. To get a more specific, the alternative approach, then is to look at specific indicators to try and assess whether Ireland is leading or is lagging on particular targets. So the challenge here is to try to determine how much of the difference in country performance is due to differences in country fundamentals such as geography, levels of development, governance structure or culture, and how much of the difference is actually due to not adopting better practices in use elsewhere. So for this analysis, what I did was I mixed most different and most similar systems design methods in order to get a sense of how Ireland is doing. So Ireland was defined as a laggard if its current performance differs considerably from peers sharing similar fundamentals. So the peer group for Ireland was the UK, Iceland, New Zealand, and Japan. These are all high-income countries with well-developed fisheries. And following NUIC, I selected 4 fundamental variables for the analysis. So remoteness is a geographic variable. Population indicates whether it's a small or large population. West indicates whether the country is part of the West. So this is a cultural variable. And Gov is whether the country is a member of the EU or not. So this is a governance variable. So just to take two examples, if you look first at marine pollution, so what you see here is that Ireland considerably underperforms relative to Iceland and New Zealand on this target. So the question is that difference due to us not adopting more sustainable practices implemented in Iceland and New Zealand? So for this indicator, it's not possible to say because geography, these countries have a more remote location and geography could be explaining this difference. So it's difficult to say in the case of marine pollution. Where things are clearer are on marine protection. So if you see here, Ireland considerably underperforms relative to Japan, New Zealand, and the UK on this indicator. We have only 2.3% of our exclusive economic zone that's protected, whereas for Japan it's 7.2%, and in the UK and New Zealand it's well above 10%. Now that difference cannot easily be explained by geography because we share a similar geography to the UK, who perform considerably better than us on this indicator. It cannot easily be explained by our small population size because New Zealand also has a small population, yet they perform considerably better. And finally, then it can't easily be explained by cultural factors or governance structures because we share a similar cultural and governance framework to the UK, who performs considerably better. So in that case, there's good reason to believe that on marine protection, Ireland is a laggard. Okay, so that type of analysis you can extend to the other indicators and also to the linkage indicators. So just for quickly, for example, if applying that procedure, what I found was that on sustainable agriculture, Ireland appears to be amongst leaders in that our performance does not considerably differ from the other peer countries on that variable. In the case of wastewater treatment, we appear to be a laggard in that we are considerably underperforming and differences in country fundamentals cannot easily explain that difference. However, in the case of renewable energy expansion, it wasn't possible to say, even though we're considerably underperforming relative to Iceland and New Zealand on this variable, geographic differences in geothermal resources could explain a large portion of that gap. So you can follow that through for all of the other indicators, and overall, you can then add an extra layer to the recommendations in the discussions with the other government departments. So overall, what I found was that on the 15 policy issues up for discussion with other government departments, Ireland was leading on 3 of the targets. It was lagging on 9 of them, and it wasn't possible to say on 3 of the policy areas. Okay, so there's limits to how far you can go with this data-driven indicator-based approach, but the tool does offer a useful starting point for inter-ministry discussions and integrated policy making, in the sense that it gives an indication of, which government departments to cooperate with, what policy areas the discussion should focus on, and you can also then get a ranking of how Ireland is performing on each of those policy areas internationally. So the tool should be seen as a complement to national policy work. Policy documents tend to go into a huge amount of detail in particular policy areas, but they often don't make the interconnections with other policy issues. So the tool, by helping to identify the relevant departments to bring to the discussion table, it can allow for a discussion of opportunities and challenges on ways to integrate policies across these different interconnected areas. So the approach can be applied to other SDGs and government departments. So there's a large literature on linkages for specific goals that can be used. And we're fortunate in Ireland to have in the national implementation plan, a clear division of SDG responsibilities across the different government departments. Although that division of responsibilities needs to be updated to reflect the change in government. And finally, then in the paper, I finish on with this point that the adoption of the approach by governments could support the emergence of two-pronged organization within government departments. So what I'm getting at here is basically a two-pronged organization is where within government departments, certain policymakers focus on, are like specialists and focus on the core business of that, of the department. So designing, for example, marine policies. And then around those specialists, you have what would be called multidisciplinarians, whose role then is to assess the interlinkages between the policy areas. Okay, and I argue that this type of structure is needed to develop more coordinated and integrated approaches to implementation. And it's not all that different from what we see happening in universities, where we have this division between disciplinary research and interdisciplinary and more policy-focused and practice-focused researchers. Okay, so that's all I want to say in the paper. Just to mention that currently I'm researching 500 partnerships. I'm looking to extend the approach to include other stakeholder groups, and I'm researching 500 partnerships in the SIDS online database to get a sense of how the tool could be used to assess participation in broader sets, not just policy partnerships, but a broader set of partnerships that could help to implement the SDGs. Okay, so thank you for your attention, and happy to hand back to you there, Pierangelo, and move to questions.
Thank you very much, David. We have questions from the audience, so I'll go straight to them. The first question is, was SDG 14 chosen for a specific reason as the example?
Yeah, so the nice thing about SDG 14 is that a lot of the early work on interlinkages actually focused on that goal. So there was useful studies out there that clearly mapped out the linkages with the other goals and targets. So that was the primary reason in my research for focusing on that.
Okay. But potentially can be applied to other SDGs as well.
Yeah, now there's, I mean, I could have, like on the fellowship I'm on, I committed to focusing on the environmental SDGs, but in the earlier studies, there was quite detailed mappings done for things like health and well-being, SDG 3, for clean energy, SDG 7, and also for agriculture.
Okay. Then another question is, did you find alternative country implementation approaches that were useful or complementary to what you're presenting? Are there insights into EU-wide versus the US or Middle East approach, perhaps?
So I don't think I have a great answer to that question, but if you were, I think the place to look for that, if you're just focused on the SDGs, would be to look at the voluntary national reviews that each country submits to the high-level political forum. So there's a database of the VNRs available at the UN on that, and several reports have been produced summarizing the different ways that countries are implementing the goals. I don't think the general approach has been more focused on putting in place institutions and not so much, so more on the interdepartmental working groups. And whereas, you know, concrete policy action isn't, I would say overall has been we haven't quite got to that yet.
And then, what is the biggest constraint to consistent international monitoring? You mentioned the slow publication of UN agencies, of their guidelines, and the lack of implementation documentation. Is there anything else, any other major constraints that you've noticed?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Okay, so the 2030 agenda is obviously an international voluntary agreement, sorry, and it's not binding. It's similar to the Paris Climate Agreement in that it's a voluntary setup. So countries, are not going to be, have a legal obligation to implement the goals and targets, but because of that, a lot of emphasis has been put not just on the governments, but also on non-state actors having a role in implementation. So, non-state actors being universities, businesses, NGOs. And what is happening around the world, what you see is that some countries are not doing very much on the SDGs, and then other countries are really pushing ahead. And this is happening in every different continent. So in the Americas, countries like Colombia, Costa Rica, Paraguay, they're really some of the most innovative work on implementation is going on down there. In Africa, it's countries like Kenya, Ghana, Ethiopia. In Europe, it's more the Scandinavian countries. We're doing okay, but we're, with a lot of sustainability issues, there can be quite a bit of greenwashing. And when you delve down into it, I mean, you're going to get that. So there's everyone wants to look like they're doing something, but I think the future is integrated approaches. It is sustainability. It's balancing these different objectives of economic prosperity, social inclusion, and environmental protection. And the way to do it is better governance. So yeah, I think there's, like in the climate sphere with the Paris Climate Agreement, you are getting leaders. And the thing with innovation is all that really matters is that some countries do it, and then once you have the new technology or new institutions and they're shown to work, they can be adopted elsewhere or like that. So the main thing is just to push ahead, and the world is so pluralistic that you're never going to. A lot of time was wasted on trying to get binding agreements. The world is too fragmented to. Essentially on the Paris Climate Agreements, the UNFCCC lost, you could say, 23 years on climate action trying to get a binding agreement. So I think we're with the 2030 agenda and the Paris Climate Agreements, we're betting the house on addressing big global. We're betting a lot on voluntary agreements to address global challenges. But I think it is a better approach than what I've been previously taking.
Right. I think we still have time for one more question. So sure. The question starts with slightly off topic. Can organizations use this dashboard, or is your focus specifically on government use, equally on partnerships for governments supported by UN agencies for core aspects such as education and health? Are there monitoring methods used in these cases?
So, yeah, the paper was very focused on government departments and policy. I'm trying to figure out now how this could be applied to other stakeholder groups. It's a bit, one of the challenges to applying it is that you don't have this nice mapping of the responsibilities across the actors that you do in the Ireland's National Implementation Plan. So in doing the database study, I'm trying to identify responsibilities based on who's participating and what they're doing. So I'm trying to develop a procedure for identifying the responsibilities. I think internationally, it's well recognized that that up to now our approaches to implementation have been very scattered and not well coordinated. So at international level, there's just an interesting example is the high-level dialogue on implementing SDG 7, which is the energy decarbonization goal. And the approach for that has been a bit different to the other ones. It's led by UN Energy. They recognize, we're not coordinated at UN level to implement this. So they're really trying to push a dialogue between those main stakeholders in the UN system and trying to develop a more coordinated approach. So the preparatory stage for the dialogue will be held in September, and the preparatory stage has started already, and they've divided it up into 5 main teams. They have a champion for each team, and they're bringing together the main stakeholders in each team, and they're trying to come out then with an overall assessment. So I think these are some of there's lots of interesting things going on, but I don't think we have found a formula yet, but yeah.
All right, so thank you very much, David. Unfortunately, we still have a few questions, but we're running out of time, so I need to wrap up the session. So thank you very much for joining us today for your very interesting and insightful talk. For those of you who are interested, SDG 15, Life on Land, will be presented by Dr. Madeleine Sabkowiak on March 24th. We'll be circulating a new registration link on the Business School, DCU Business School channels and the .lab channels for everyone who would like to listen in. So thanks again for joining us today, David, and to our audience. And I'll hope to see many of you with us again in 2 weeks' time.
Thanks so much, Pierangelo. Great to see you again.
Nice to see you again. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye now.